Hey YouTube, Twig here, bringing you all an update to my Worm Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck profile for September 2024. Wanted to update the Worm deck. It's been a couple years since the last update, and it's one of those overlooked Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that we may not see for a good while, but I believe I said in the last video of me doing an update to the deck is all it takes for it to get more support. Maybe we'll see some added spell and trap support that the Worm deck could definitely use for its playstyle, which at this point its playstyle still revolves around being able to summon out your big boss monster Worm 0 with the added effects depending on how many Worm monsters you use to make it. So let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. So we'll go ahead and start off with the main deck monsters. For our main Worm combo, we run 3 copies of Worm Zex. When it's normal summon, you can send 1 Reptile Worm from your deck to the graveyard. If you control a face-up Worm Yagen, this card cannot be destroyed by battle. The combo with Yagen is what you utilize with your 2 Worm monsters, because we also run 3 copies of Worm Yagen. If the only monster you control is Worm Zex, you can special summon this card from your graveyard in face down defense position. If you do, remove it from play when it's removed from the field or banished. If you do, you basically, with this card, when it's flipped face up, select 1 face up monster your opponent controls, return it to the owner's hand. So it gives you setup for 2 Worm monsters in the field, with Worm Zex and Worm Yagen both being level 4 monsters. You also have rank 4 options available to you with this play, but just being able to send Yagen gives you another Worm resource on top of Zex to be able to use against your opponent. And also 3 copies of Worm King. This card can be tribute summoned in face-up attack position by tributing 1 Reptile Worm monster. You can tribute 1 Reptile type Worm monster to select 1 card your opponent controls and destroy it. So even with the Zex and Yagen setup, you can have the tribute, because we do have an additional normal summon option in this deck in the form of your Worm King, and then that tribute to gain additional power with this 2700 attack point monster. So 3 copies of it. It's, I would say, one of the better Worm cards just for its ease of being able to get on the field and its destruction power also. And then also 3 copies of Worm Carteros. With its flip effect, you can add 1 level 4 or lower Reptile Worm monster from your deck to your hand. A good amount of these, I would say, are definitely slow compared to the current game state, but it's once again the best that the Worms have to go off of, just being able to use that flip of Worm Carteros for you to then search out other Worms as well. The same goes for Worm Links, which its flip effect during each end phase, if it's face up, draw 1 card. It may not resolve too much as an option, but another big majority thing to remember with these Worms is having the different names to be able to send off of the cost to be able to summon out Worm 0 onto the field also. When we do run a good number of 1 of Worm monsters, so we have other targets with our main go-to spell to be able to set them up in the graveyard. Also 1 copy of Worm Prince, 1 Worm Milidith, the 1 copy of Worm Barsis, and the Worm Apocalypse, with the one that I ran in the last deck profile being the 1 copy of Worm Queen. You contribute some of this card in face-up attack position by tributing 1 Reptile type Worm monster, and once per turn you can tribute 1 Reptile Worm monster to special summon 1 Reptile type Worm monster from your deck with a level less than or equal to the tributed monster, as another way just to give you more setup of other Worm monsters on the field as well. But still, I'd say the bigger weakness with this is just being able to use the tribute of a Worm Reptile monster for your other one on the field. You still will miss out on that flip effect, but it'll get through the different Worms we have in the deck also. More of the generic Reptile support, we also run the deck 3 copies of Evil Dragon Ananta, with the spell setup being Future Fusion for sending and setting up our Worm monsters in the graveyard. We can set up a good number of Reptile monsters for us to use with Ananta. It cannot be normal summon or set. It must be special summoned by banishing all Reptile monsters you control and in your graveyard. This card's attack and defense become the number of monsters banished, special summon, times 600, once per turn. During the end phase, you can target 1 card on the field and destroy it. The attack gain is the big part, because we can set up a good majority of the reptiles we've already shown. That's an immense attack boost for our Evil Dragon Ananta as well to be able to use against our opponent. And lastly, with some of the other traps we run on the deck, 1 copy of Aperia. If it's summoned, you draw 1 card. You can only use this effect of Aperia once per turn. Being a 500 attack reptile monster, it's just another resource that can be summoned onto the field, give you a draw to at least keep the hand consistency going in the deck also. It's not a Worm reptile monster, but still can be summoned off of some other cards in the deck. For the spells, we're running 3 copies of of Future Fusion. During your first standby phase, after this card's activation, show one fusion monster in your extra deck, send the fusion materials listed on it from your main deck to the graveyard, and during your second standby phase after this activation, fusion summon one fusion monster from your extra deck with the same name as the monster you showed, and target it with this card. So then you have your summon for your Worm 0 on the field. The big play, though, is the Worm setup in the graveyard. You can send a good variety of Worm monsters for this card, and just needing 2 or more reptile worm monsters to make this card, you could potentially send all the worm monsters to the graveyard. You'll just gain the additional effects based on all the different named ones for its play. And also running 3 copies of Worm Call once per turn. If your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, you can special summon 1 reptile monster from your hand in face down defense position. So more setup for your other worm monsters, just being able to summon out that monster in face down defense position before you go for your other set or normal summon of your other worm monster also. It's very useful for that play, being able to use this card and then being able to also have that setup for your other monsters as well for your graveyard summons. And 2 copies of Double Summon. This was also the card I like to use with Worm King, having the Worm Yagan and Zex play. Then you use Double Summon to then summon out your Worm King and giving you that additional resource on the field to use for its tribute. For the one-ofs for the spells, 1 copy of Pot of Acquisitiveness. Now this is so we can recycle some of our banished worm monsters to then reuse Evil Dragon Ananta again. And 1 copy of Monster Reborn as another variable target for Eperia to summon back for more draw and giving us another reptile resource on the field also. And then for the traps, 3 copies of W Nebula Meteorite. Change all face-down monsters on the field to face-up defense. And during the end phase of this turn, change all face-up light reptile monsters you control to face-down defense. Then draw 1 card for each. After that, you can special summon 1 level 7 or higher light reptile monster from your deck. I would say this is the best card in the deck, honestly. This is just a card that is meant to set up the main go-to worm play. It gives you the flip back face-down, so you can use the worm flip effects during your next turn. And then it also being able to summon out your Worm Queen or Worm King to the field from your deck also. You don't need to tribute some of those cards out. There's no restriction. They aren't like Monarch cards. It's just the lack of tribute needed for these cards. The big play is just being able to summon out these monsters on the field with less of a restriction using this trap card. And also 2 copies of Damage Reptile. Once per turn, when you take damage from a battle involving a reptile monster, you can special summon 1 reptile monster from your deck with attack less than or equal to the damage you took. So no restriction on the card's effect, but one of my favorite ways to get out of Eperia in the deck whenever one of our worm monsters takes any battle damage also. With the last of the traps being 2 copies of Offering to the Snake Deity. Target 1 face-up reptile you control, and 2 cards your opponent controls. Destroy all 3 targets. So taking out one of your own cards for 2 of your opponents, I would say is always a great trap to rely on, just for the target of your card also. And then for the extra deck, 2 copies of Worm 0. I would feel 2 is really all you need. I know I ran 3 copies of Future Fusion, but that's just so we can see the card more often. Worm 0 at most, you're going to just need the 1 anyway, because you're going to use the first send to send all of your worm reptile monsters to the graveyard, and then have you, aside from Evil Dragon Ananta, you can only send 2 or more worm reptile type monsters anyway, so you can't send cards like Eperia or Evil Dragon Ananta off of this card. But then you'll thin the deck down to at least be able to draw into those needed cards to then use for banishing all of your other reptile monsters to hit an immensely powerful Evil Dragon Ananta on the field before your Worm 0 even gets out of the field. Depending on how many materials with different names you use, also gains your Worm 0 different card effects. But the basis is you'll always guarantee send these 4 worm monsters. It's very similar to the equip lineup for, Noble Knight Isolde. When that card was able to be used for warrior decks, you would have the different equip spells. Consider these your equip spells. Cards you would never want in your hand, but cards you would send off of the engine for additional worm monsters to use with Worm 0 to get the full 6 or more card effects also. And then also the 1 copy of Alien Shock Trooper M-Frame works with the reptile monsters, and this is the card you use to set up your A counters on your opponent's card, since no other deck card in the deck focuses on A counters. The 1 Barricade Board Blocker, along with the 1 Lena the Light Charmer, 1 Hit Potion Engen, the 1 Nightmare Unicorn, and then also the 1 Blackluster Soldier, Soldier of Chaos, and the 1 Underworld Goddess of the Closed World. And for the Xyz monsters, 1 King of the Feral Imps, one of my favorites to make in the deck, just pretty generic to add any reptile from our deck to our hand. So with the 2 level 4 monsters that we overlay with, we can just use those 2 monsters to go into King of the Feral Imps, and even use that card to then search out our Evil Dragon Ananta, an easier search for one of our bigger boss monsters. And then also the Bujinti Tsukuyomi, along with the 1 Baguska, the 1 Starliege Paladynamo, the 1 Gaga Cowboy, and the 1 Zeus for the rest of the extra deck monsters. And as for some of the go-to plays, as I mentioned before, your main one is relying on Future Fusion. So then during your next standby phase, if you have to play it defensive with some of your worm monsters on the field, you have those cards as well. If you have your W Nebulite Meteorite, then you have the option to change all your face-down monsters face down. You have the Yagan during the next turn to then flip up the special summon of your level 7 monster. But then after your next standby phase comes around, you use Future Fusion, sending as many of your worm monsters to the graveyard, and then using either of those monsters for Evil Dragon Ananta. That's where the rank 4 play I said comes in handy, because then you can use King of the Feral Imps to search out this card, having the banish of potential 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 cards just off of that, times the 6 can hit an immense amount, which could almost equal to the amount needed to be able to wipe your opponent out of the duel. We have more worm monsters to use if you want to send even more to hit that 8k mark with 1 dragon also. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoyed. Like I said, I always like to update the Worm deck. It's one of those overlooked Yu-Gi-Oh decks, and I would say one of the oldest archetypes that has definitely not gotten support for a good while, with Hidden Arsenal 3 being the last time we've really seen anything aside from the trap for the Worm monsters in a good while. But as always, until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and Kira Twig out.